welcome back everyone to English 221. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 21st. And what I wanted to do was to talk about Jane Eyre and also put some closure on persuasion. If you'll remember, I gave an extension for your first paper, so certainly you can submit in your paper early, but you have up until Thursday the 23rd at 11:59 p.m. to submit in your first paper via PDF to my email, ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And at this point, you should have submitted in a journal on Frankenstein, and I would have returned that to you. And you should have submitted in a journal about persuasion, and I should have returned that to you. So if that's not the case, please contact me. And I'm hopeful that you'll be able to use some of the commentary in your journals to formulate your paper. Not that you're required to. And of course, you can also write on story of an hour, but that's a very different kind of exercise because it is a short story. So you have to do very detailed precision analysis in a way that you wouldn't necessarily do with a novel. And in terms of persuasion, I had left you with the attendance question about whether or not you would want to live in the world of landed gentry. It seemed fairly universal that you would prefer not to because of all of the rules and regulations, despite the number of privileges that would come. And it's something that we will reinvestigate when we talk about Jane Eyre. And that Jane Austen was, at least for her time, a rather progressive novelist. And she tries to show through Anne Elliot the rather vacuous and empty life of the landed gentry. And there are a few quotes in Persuasion that I just wanted to draw your attention to. The first appears for me on page 39. This would be in chapter 3. And basically a conversation is going on between Anne Elliot and her family about professions. And there we learn from basically Sir Eliot the reasons why he's concerned about the new rising middle class. And he says, "There are 2 points offensive to me. I have 2 strong grounds of objection to it. First, as being the means of bringing persons of obscure birth into undue distinction, and raising men to honors which their fathers and grandfathers never dreamt of. And secondly, as it cuts up a man's youth and vigor most horribly. A sailor grows old sooner than any other man. I've observed it all my life." And we know how important appearance is for Sir Walter. He surrounded himself with mirrors, for instance. And Mrs. Clay continues on a few paragraphs afterwards, talking also about professions, saying, "I've long been convinced," for me this is on page 41 by the way, "I've long been convinced, though every profession is necessary and honorable in its turn, it is only the lot of those who are not obliged to follow any, who can live in a regular way, in the country, choosing their own hours, following their own pursuits, and living on their own property, without the torment of trying for more. It is only their lot, I say, to hold the blessings of health and good appearance to the utmost." So this is her perspective of what living in a regular way is, which is obviously quite different from the experience that most of us, if not all of us, have. And we continue on with Persuasion when Anne is talking to her sister Mary. We know that Mary is very much the epitome of what one would expect for female in that station and status during the time period, as she maintains that she's continually ill-used just because people are paying attention to her. She is the hypochondriac and oftentimes is subject to very dramatic displays of things like the vapors. But Mary is certainly better than Elizabeth, who is very cold and distant from Anne. At least Mary has some sort of a relationship. And when Anne and Mary are speaking, Anne is talking a little bit about how she's helping the family move. And then she mentions offhandedly, Anne that is, for me this is on page 59, and this is in response to her sister's question in chapter 5. "Oh, what would you possibly have to do?" And Anne says, "Oh, many things," and she talks about all of the ways that she's helped the family. And Then I had all my own little concerns to arrange, books and music to divide, and all my trunks to repack. So for Anne, the idea of taking care of herself is an afterthought. And we know how ultimately Anne has been excluded from the family and not given respect and really not given affection, which is one of the ways that we see how Anne changes over the course of the novel when she's put in a situation where others show her both affection and also show her respect. A minor detail, and this would be in chapter 5 towards the ending on page 60. And again, this is when Anne and Mary are talking a little bit about some of the social expectations that Mary's in-laws, the Musgroves, might have. And Mary says, well, I'm assuming that, you'll want to wait until the call at the great house, they come to you. And Anne says, no, I would never think of standing on such ceremony. And then later on, they go to the great house and they sit the full half hour. And the idea of the full half hour is that this is the expected amount of time that one is expected to socialize. Think of it almost as if when you attend a social function, something like a wedding, for instance, where it's expected that you wouldn't leave until after the ceremony, and in terms of the reception, after certain milestones have occurred, such as the cutting of the cake, for instance. But the expectations are much more strict in this social venue, something that we'll see Jane Eyre struggle with as well when we move to Jane Eyre. And again, talking about Mary, we talked a little bit about how Mary was complaining that she had to stay with the sick child when there was this interesting new man in town, Mr. Wentworth. And one point that Mary makes that is actually a rather valid point. This is in chapter 7, when she's asked, how can you spend your time away from your sick child? And she says, well, his papa can, so why shouldn't I? And that is a valid point there, the expectation that female should sacrifice. We know that when Frederick is introduced, there's going to be a lot of vying for his attention as a prospective mate, because we know that ultimately the major impetus in this novel is marrying for fortune and for status. And at this point, Frederick Wentworth has went and gotten his worth. In other words, he's achieved both status and fortune. And we see him talking, Frederick Wentworth, with his sister, who, of course, has rented Kellynch Hall, which is why he's back in the social circle of the Elliot family. And talking about, from his perspective, that women shouldn't be on board a naval ship because they would be uncomfortable. And his sister says, "Oh, Frederick, I cannot believe it of you. All idle refinement. Women may be as comfortable on board as in the best house in England. I believe I've lived as much on board as most women, and I know nothing superior to the accommodations of a man of war." In other words, this is the author's way of saying that the stereotype of the weak female who needed to be protected and needed to be spoiled was one that was hurting more than helping the female. And she continues on. For me, this is on page 90, and she continues on talking to her brother and says, "I hate to hear you talking so, Frederick, like a fine gentleman, as if women were all fine ladies instead of rational creatures. We none of us expect to be in smooth waters all of our days." So this is in chapter 8, or on page 90 for me. And as we continue on through the novel, and by this point we're approximately halfway through the novel, where Anne admits that she's ashamed of her family and how they're trying to impress a distant family member who's of superior rank, Lady Dalrymple. And at this point, Anne is contemplating the possibility of having a union with Mr. Elliot. And she and Mr. Elliot are talking about what makes good company. This is on page 174. And this would be chapter 4 of the second book, because the book is divided into two. And Anne says to Mr. Elliot, "My idea of good company, Mr. Elliot, is the company of clever, well-informed people who have a great deal of conversation. That is what I call good company." In other words, Anne doesn't care about social status. One of the reasons why she's visiting Mrs. Smith, her old friend, who no longer has money nor status. And Of course, the response from Mr. Elliot is, and this is on page 174 in my novel, "You're mistaken," he said gently. "That is not good company. That is the best company. Good company requires only birth, education, and manners." Again, so the importance of social status and appearances. And as we continue on towards the ending of the novel, and I had mentioned this last class, where Anne is talking about whose feelings are strongest, men's or women's. And there's some interesting commentary from the author through the character of Anne about female. For me, this is on page 263, and this is in chapter 11 of the second part of the novel. And Anne says that men's feelings may be the strongest, but the same spirit of analogy will authorize me to assert that ours, women's, are the most tender. Man is more robust than woman, but he is not longer lived, which exactly explains my view of the nature of their attachments. Nay, it would be too hard upon you if it were otherwise. You have difficulties and privations and dangers enough to struggle with as men. You're always laboring and toiling, exposed to heavy risk and hardship. Your home, country, friends, all quitted. Neither time, nor health, nor life to be called your own. It would be too hard indeed if a woman's feelings were to be added to all of this. And then, of course, she makes the commentary that men have had every advantage of female in telling their own story. Education has been there so much higher a degree. That's a few paragraphs later, page 264, in my text. And this, I think, is a way that ultimately we have the author defying many of the stereotypes of the cults of true womanhood, and the importance of female not being excluded, but also the importance of female being valued. And Anne says, while the woman you love lives and lives for you, then ultimately men can continue on. All the privilege I claim for my own sex, which is what Anne says about herself, but it's not a very enviable one, is that of loving the longest when existence or hope is gone. Of course, that leads us to the very romantic and happy ending for Persuasion. So now that we've seen a very male-centric world through Frankenstein, now that we've seen the same world through a female's perspective in Persuasion, now we move to Jane Eyre, which is going to give us a very different kind of story, because we're going to talk about somebody who is not part of that world of privilege. Now, one of the things about Jane Eyre, as I'm sure you've noticed, is that it is a rather long text. But the good news is that it moves very quickly, unlike Persuasion. Persuasion was very much written in these long sentences to kind of mimic that long leisurely lifestyle of the landed gentry. So I think you'll find that it moves more quickly. And Jane Eyre is very much a Gothic romance. So we had talked a little bit about the Gothic tradition with Frankenstein, and we will see this again, the idea of dark corridors and mysteries and so forth. We also will get a text that's very clear with its social and religious commentary. While that might have been implied in our previous text, it'll be directly stated in Jane Eyre, which was originally published under a pseudonym, Currer Bell. And one of the reviewers, a female reviewer no less, Elizabeth Rigby from the Quarterly Review, indicated that Jane Eyre's author is blamed for the highest moral offense a novel can commit, that of making an unworthy character interesting. The book is mischievous and vulgar, pandering to the public taste for illegitimate romance. And Elizabeth Rigby also maintained that a female could have never written this text. Obviously, she was wrong on multiple counts. But I had indicated that when you read Jane Eyre that you should look very carefully at the names, because they oftentimes are significant. So for instance, think about the name Jane. If you've ever heard the expression plain Jane, and that's basically what we get. Jane is a poor orphan, but despite the fact that she's poor and that she is parentless and that she doesn't have any social status, she has self-respect. in this coming-of-age novel. And Jane will be an active participant, not an observer like Anne. The great feminist Erica Young said that Jane may be the first heroine in fiction to know that she needs her own identity more than she needs marriage. Her determination not to relinquish selfhood for love could well belong to a contemporary heroine. And I'm always struck when I get to Jane Eyre, what a contemporary novel it is. Especially because even in today's world, the idea that female needs to be involved in some union is one that is still prevalent. Now, this was in the introduction of the version that I had ordered for Jane Eyre, but as you know, I've included web links for all of the texts, so you can read them on the web if you wanted to, because they are now in public domain. The preface to Jane Eyre, where the author herself wrote that conventionality is not morality, and that's something that we are going to be seeing, as well as self-righteousness is not religion. It's something that was implied in Persuasion, but will be directly seen in Jane Eyre. And I think of Jane Eyre as 5 separate books. Perhaps that would make the length of the text a little bit easier for you to manipulate. Gateshead is what I call the first book. Those are chapters 1 through 4, where we find out about Jane's youth before she goes to boarding school. She goes to boarding school at Lowood. This is chapters 5 through 10. And then we see the adulthood in Thornfield, which is where we have a romance occur. And this is in chapters 11 through 27. We've got Morehouse and Marshend, chapters 28 and 35, Jane's story after her time in Thornfield. And then the resolution to Jane's story at a place called Ferndene, chapters 26 through 38. So I thought that I would talk about those first couple of books. And chapter 1 introduces us to Gateshead. And think about the idea of a gate. A gate represents entrapment, but a gate can also be opened as well as can be closed. So Jane could escape her entrapment, but right now she's trapped in her home. And home oftentimes, as we saw in The Cult of True Womanhood, was a kind of prison for female during the time period. We're introduced to Jane in chapter 1, where there's no possibility of taking a walk that day, because leaving the home and taking a walk provides freedom. And it's something that we saw in Persuasion, how excited everybody was just to go for a walk, because they could not only see different sights, but they could also meet different people. Jane sits cross-legged at the beginning, reading on a dreary November day. Again, thinking about the idea that females should not be sitting cross-legged, that would be something that would be acceptable for a boy, but not for a girl. And she's reading, and we know for The Cult of True Womanhood the dangers of reading, because it could put ideas in a female's mind. A November day, think about the sort of gothic idea of the setting, that things are dreary in a November, because this is a gothic novel. And in chapter 2, we see how Jane as a child resists punishment. That basically she's been taken in as an orphan by some distant family relations. In some ways, this is almost like a fairy tale story with the evil stepmother, Mrs. Reed, so to speak, and Jane's cousins, which could be, the evil step sisters and stepbrother. And Jane is very much the outsider and treated poorly. We see how ultimately she gets into a altercation with her cousin, John Reed. Not of her fault, but she's the one who's punished. He isn't. And in chapter 2, we see that Jane resisted punishment all the way, which was a new thing for me. And think about how unusual this would be for, first, a female to resist punishment. Secondly, a poor orphan who's an outsider to resist. Or how about the idea of just a child to resist an adult? So already Jane is showing an incredible amount of strength, which we will see develop over the course of the novel. Where she's taken to the, quote, Red Room. This is a place where we're introduced to the possibility of some sort of a gothic mystery where perhaps there's a ghost. We do know that Jane is left there alone and that she's quite frightened. And in chapter 3, we hear from the adult Jane. So basically, this is Jane, the narrator, as an adult, looking back on her childhood. And she says that she ought to forgive Mrs. Reed. But child Jane, I ought to forgive Mrs. Reed, but she couldn't at the time because she didn't have enough maturity. So part of this novel is showing how Jane has grown and matured as an individual. And also, Jane said that she didn't want to belong to poor people when she was a child, even if that meant that she would have love and affection and freedom and independence. And she says, I was not heroic enough to purchase liberty at the price of caste. Again, think about the idea of persuasion, where even someone like Anne Elliot is tempted, at least briefly, to marry Mr. Elliot so that she can have her position again. The backstory is that Jane's birth mother had married a poor clergyman, and we know in Persuasion this would obviously be a bad match. She's disinherited because she married a poor clergyman, because Jane's family had come from, or Jane's birth mother's family had come from wealth. And then they had Jane, and then Jane's parents died, and her mother's brother, in other words, Jane's uncle, Mr. Reed, took in the Jane, who was the Jane baby, who was basically an orphan. And then Mr. Reed died, and then Mrs. Reed basically takes over. Think about the idea of a reed. That's something that's stiff and brittle and unattractive. That's very much how Mrs. Reed is. And she grudgingly raises Jane while she spoils her own children, John, Eliza, and Georgiana. And John was the one that Jane had an argument with, which resulted in Jane being put in the Red Room. Eventually she's released after Jane is convinced that she saw some sort of supernatural episode. And then at this point, Mrs. Reed realizes that she can no longer control Jane. So she's going to send Jane off to school, a boarding school. This is where, in Chapter 4, Mr. Brocklehurst is called in. He's described as this black pillar. He's supposed to represent a rigid, hypocritical religion of the Lowood boarding school. Think about the name Lowood. It's a place that's low. It's a place that is dark and dank and unhealthy. And this is where orphans would be sent so that they could get some schooling, so that they could ultimately learn how to become things like schoolmistresses. And when Mr. Brocklehurst begins to quiz Jane about religion, he asks her, well, how will you avoid hell? And her rather sassy response is, well, I'll avoid hell by not dying. Obviously, that wasn't the answer that he was expecting. Again, we see a rebellious Jane, despite her youth, despite her social station, despite her gender. And it's one of the reasons why Jane is such a popular heroine in literature. And Jane tells Mrs. Reed outright that she's a bad, hard-hearted, and deceitful woman. And while the adult Jane might regret saying these things were the truth. Nevertheless, in Chapter 5 is where we have Jane transition, leaving Gateshead to Lowood. And this is an opportunity, despite the horrific conditions, for Jane to experience the outside world. The primitive conditions with many deprivations were common at the time for these boarding schools that were oftentimes supported by religious institutions, illustrating the hypocrisy of religion, which is a commentary that Charlotte Bronte has in this particular text. And one of the things, however, that occurs is that Jane is introduced to a very pivotal teacher, Miss Temple. And again, think about the name temple, the idea that a temple is a safe place, a kind of haven, which is what happens to Jane, that she has a safe place. Jane also meets a friend, and her name is Helen Burns. And this Helen Burns will burn an impression on Jane. So again, the names are very deliberate. And the young Jane in Chapter 8 says that if others didn't love her, she'd rather die than live. She couldn't bear to be solitary and hated. And we'll see how Jane matures as she becomes older and realizes that that's not the way to live. Helen, her friend, in Chapter 9, eventually dies of tuberculosis, in part because Helen is so focused on religion and the afterlife that she doesn't really seem to have that much of a will to live, unlike Jane, who appreciates the healing power of nature. Keep Frankenstein in mind again when we talked about the healing power of nature. And again, we can think of nature as a female presence. Once again, we've got a motherless child, which is Jane, but if nature is serving as Jane's mother, then she's not necessarily motherless. Something we'll see later on in the novel. And Jane says, this world is pleasant. It would be dreary to be called from it. So there are so many deaths because of tuberculosis that eventually authorities are brought in and improvements are made to the Lowood School. And again, this is a commentary by the author about boarding schools. But we also see how Jane is able to, through education, find a certain level of strength and a certain level of independence. And despite the fact that she has a certain level of independence, she sees herself as being able to be of service or show servitude to others. First as a teacher in Lowood School, and then after Miss Temple marries and leaves, Jane wants to find a new servitude in chapter 10 by boldly advertising for employment as a governess. Again, a very bold move for a female to basically be advertising her services for employment during this time period. And she does get employment in Thornfield's estate. And think about the name Thornfield. The field is positive. It's representational of things like nature and open expanses. But thorns can hurt and can draw blood. So this is a place where she's going to experience both positives and negatives. And she meets the housekeeper there, Mrs. Fairfax, who is greatly relieved that Jane is there because Mrs. Fairfax says that there are other servants there. Mrs. Fairfax isn't a servant. She's the housekeeper. And that, she really can't interact with them because there is just too much of a difference in their social stations. Saying that, quote, they're only servants and one can't converse with them in terms of equality. So she's grateful because now she has some company with Jane. And Adele Varennes is Jane's pupil. This is Mr. Rochester's ward, possibly his illegitimate child. He's the master of the estate, but he still hasn't been introduced at this point. And we hear strange ghost-like laughs in Thornfield, and again, descriptions that are very gothic of dark and shadowy hallways and rooms and so forth. In chapter 11, Jane talks about how she's becoming bored with only the company of Mrs. Fairfax and the servants, and that human beings must have action, she says in chapter 12. Women are supposed to be very calm generally, but women feel just as men feel. They suffer from too rigid a constraint, too absolute a stagnation. It is narrow-minded to say they ought to confine themselves to making puddings and knitting stockings, to playing on the piano and embroidering bags. And again, I think about Persuasion and the message that we see over and over again in Persuasion about the importance of keeping busy. It's something that the Musgrove family does very well. It's something also that we see Jane admire in others, that if individuals can maintain a sense of purpose, something that Jane's family doesn't do because they're too concerned with appearances and with social functions rather than doing something for others or doing something to keep themselves occupied. And basically, we're getting the same message here in chapter 12. So Jane decides to go out for a walk. We know how important walks are again. She's going to post a letter for Mrs. Fairfax. This is where Jane happens to meet a stranger whom she helps. That stranger happens to be Mr. Rochester, who is the master of the estate. And he's 20 years Jane's senior. He fell off of his horse, and Jane is, quote, pleased to have done something, an active thing, unquote. Again, the importance of having purpose and meaning in one's life, despite one's gender. And that Rochester is described as masculine, dark, strong, and stern, very much like the Byronic romantic hero. Again, think about this as the Romantic period, as we talked about with Frankenstein, with Shelley, Keats, and Byron. This flawed man that could be saved by female, perhaps. So this gives you a little bit of an idea of some of what's happening in Jane Eyre. And you'll notice that in the notes below, not only have I indicated these episodes, but I also have a version of Jane Eyre that was done by the BBC. And they are known for doing very accurate representations of literary works. So Jane Eyre is a long novel, and this is a long movie in 4 parts. And I'm not in any way suggesting that watching the BBC version would be a substitute for reading the text, because you will see that there are omissions. But nevertheless, if you find yourself struggling with reading Jane Eyre just because of its pure length, I thought you might want to know about the BBC version, which again is in 4 parts, and I've indicated all 4. And what I thought I would do next class is continue on with what happens with Jane and Rochester, and then put some closure onto Jane Eyre next class, and also draw your attention to where we are in terms of due dates, because before you know it, things will go very quickly. We know that Jane shows strength and independence to Rochester. We find out that Rochester inherited Thornfield Hall, and we see Jane's strength with Rochester right at the very beginning. He asks her, "Am I handsome?" She says no. You know, you're not supposed to say that. He asks Jane to speak. She remains silent. Eventually stating that nothing freeborn would submit to insolence even for a salary. So, and then in chapter 15, Rochester's bed is set on fire, perhaps by the servant Grace Poole. There's a mystery that needs to be unfolded. Mysteries are part of the Gothic tradition. Jane assists Rochester, so we see how capable Jane is, just like we saw how capable Anne Elliot was in Persuasion. And then in chapter 16, Rochester brings in a beautiful, vain, and arrogant girlfriend, Miss Blanche Ingram, just to kind of shake things up a little bit. And he brings friends to Thornfield, demanding that Jane keep him company. And of course, at this point, Jane has secretly fallen in love with him, but does not condemn him for wanting to marry only for connections and for social status, which seems to be what Miss Ingram is about. Again, we see in the world of Persuasion how someone might have felt that way. And then we're introduced to a mysterious man, Mr. Mason. So that's chapter 18. So that's around the place where I'll be picking up next class, starting with around chapter 13 or so, when Jane is interacting with Rochester and Thornfield. And then we'll see what happens after Thornfield as well. But in terms of our course outline, you can see that our semester ends on July 7th, which is a Thursday. That's when we have our final exam, and that's when our second paper would be due at the latest, because literally the semester will be over. So this Thursday, we'll put some closure onto Jane Eyre, and if we can't, we'll go into the Tuesday. Notice that because of that, I've given an extension on the Jane Eyre journal. You now have up until the 28th, which is a Tuesday, to submit in that journal, though you can always submit it in early. On Tuesday the 28th, we're going to talk about Emily Dickinson. This is how the semester will be speeded up, because we're just going to be reading a few sample poems from Emily Dickinson. I'm going to actually let you choose a poem that you might want to discuss in the discussion forum. Miss Emily wrote over 1,000 poems, as we'll talk about. So you're going to have a lot of choices, and I'll direct you to some websites as well where you could do a little bit of scouring. But basically, I also have a biography to show you about Emily Dickinson that does a good amount of quoting from her poetry as well. So that will give you a good overview of Emily Dickinson. If we each talk about, albeit briefly, a different poem, and I'll talk to you about one of my favorite poems and why it's one of my favorites. On the 30th, Thursday, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And this is a biographical novel. It's less literary than the other texts we're reading. It's going to be a much faster read. And we're going to see the female experience in the context of slavery, since we've been seeing females in worlds of privilege, and now Jane Eyre in a world that's been separated from privilege, yet she still is surrounded by privilege. What happens when you are enslaved, literally as well as figuratively? And that's what we will see for female and Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And then we end the semester with the Novella, The Awakening. So we revisit Kate Chopin. That will be on the 5th of July, where I think you'll see some similarities with the story of An Hour. And Novella isn't quite as long as a novel, so it should go very quickly. But it is longer than a short story. And then that just puts closure for us on the 7th, the final exam, which will be an essay exam. Open book, open notes. And if we were meeting in person, you would have 3 hours to take that exam, the length of our class time. Instead, what I will do is give you 24 hours to take that exam because we're meeting online. So I'll post it on the 7th. And then you'll have 24 hours to return it to me. But basically, I don't expect you to spend 24 hours working on it. I expect you to spend 2 to 3 hours working on it. And what I'm going to do is just give you a series of essay questions and ask you to choose within them. And certainly, I'm not expecting anything as well written or as polished as what you would do for a journal or a paper, something that you would do at home. What I'm really looking for is for you to be able to synthesize some of the major topics and themes over the course of the semester. So the best way to prepare for the final exam is obviously to read all of the texts and to watch all of the class videos and to read all of the class discussion posts. You're not required to respond to your classmates if you don't want to, but you certainly can if you wanted to. But read all of their posts and my responses to those posts. That would probably also help you perhaps with papers as well, since many of you have made some rather interesting observations over the course of this semester. So for today's attendance question about Jane Eyre, because I'm well aware that you're working on a paper and that you may not necessarily have gotten as far in the text as I've already discussed, and you may not have completed the text, certainly. So I thought I would give you an attendance question that wouldn't necessarily be dependent on your having read up until a particular point. So your attendance question is due on the class discussion forum on Thursday at 9 a.m. Thus far in your reading, do you like or dislike the novel Jane Eyre, and why? So thus far in your reading, do you like or dislike what you've read in Jane Eyre, and why? So that gives you a little bit of time to catch up with your reading. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class with Jane Eyre. Take care. Bye-bye.